Welcome to the 2020 DC Black Film Festival. We certainly appreciate your support. Check out dcbff.org for more details about the festival and this year's lineup of films and events. You just watched The Color of Justice, and now we're going to find out a little bit more about the filmmaker behind the film you just saw. I'm Kevin Sampson, founder and director of the DC Black Film Festival, and I'd like to introduce our panelists briefly before we get into our Q&A today. On the line with me, I have Marjolaine Grappe, director of The Color of Justice.
Hello.
Hey, how are you? So, Marjolaine, the first question I wanted to ask you is, when did you first fall in love with film?
I think it started, I started as a journalist, and for many years I was a foreign correspondent. So I was based first in Washington, D.C., then in New Delhi in India, and then in Shanghai in China. And the more I was covering news stories, the more I wanted to stay. I wanted to spend more time with the people. I wanted to go from like purely the news to more human stories. And I think that's how I slowly evolved into making documentaries. My first documentary was actually, my first I started with long form journalism. And the first work I did was about Guantanamo. Then I covered the one-child policy extensively in China. And I did a couple of stories after that.
Yeah, I find that fascinating and but very cool, you know, starting in long form journalism and then going into documentary filmmaking. I think that especially a film like this, there's slight differences, right? But we could definitely see how you would want to tackle this subject. And so I'd like to ask you that, like, how long did it take to put this project together and why did you want to take it on?
So this project has a totally different history than all the other projects I worked on before. Usually the kind of films that I was making had like a heavy commentary that were explaining things. You would go from like discovering one person to the other and like all together you would have the full picture. And one day while I was making those kind of stories, a friend of mine approached me and told me that this American filmmaker was created a docufiction because he wanted a film, a trial for Eric Garners to happen. And so he was making this mock-up trial in New York City, and that for his film, he needed foreign journalists. And so he didn't want an American journalist because he felt he would be polarized between like CNN or Fox. And so he wanted someone outside. And in France at the time, I had just received the Albert Prize, which is kind of like the equivalent of the Pulitzer here. And so that's kind of like how I got involved in this project. And so I was supposed to be a journalist in this film covering the trial. And I loved the idea. But I told him, like, it's so interesting what you're doing that in exchange, would you be okay with like me doing a documentary on what you're doing? So you would be doing a docufiction and I would be doing a documentary geared towards a European audience. And so that's how it all started. And that's how I started being involved in the project. And so most of the work to organize the trial, to find the participants, to prep everyone was done by Roy Messinger, who is the director of the other film that was geared towards an American audience. And I came in, I would say at the last minute. I arrived in New York City a week before the trial, and I started meeting everyone. And for me, that was really important because I wanted to have maybe the distance that he could no longer have, you know, like he was spending so much time with everyone trying to organize everything. But for me, it was just like meeting people on the spot and listening to their stories and trying to piece it all together and trying to really stick to the fact and everyone's story.
You know, that's definitely interesting because I was kind of wondering why, you know, at times we do go into more of like a courtroom drama and then we take a break to kind of actually walk alongside, you know, with whoever you might be speaking with. But I appreciate the full context of, you know, just understanding kind of how this came together. You know, Eric Garner passed in 2014. And so here we are in 2020. And I think I Can't Breathe really kind of came to the forefront with his death. And so I'm wondering for you, again, I don't think you hit this just now in that last question, but like, how long did it take from the time you got on the ground to now we're seeing this film? But how do you think his story really resonates with today and today's climate?
So to answer your first question, we had only about 2 weeks of shoot. And so we came in, we met everyone, the trial happened, and the trial, for a lot of reasons, had to be condensed into one day. And so that day we were there, and it wasn't our camera that was actually recording the trial. It was the New York team that was recording everything in the trial. And so what we were concentrating on was actually getting like side stories, like the feeling of like the people who were participating in the trial, and how, because everyone is really not playing a role, it's their own role, you know. There was a lot of tension. It was really emotional, and it was great to be hanging out in the hallways and like catching up everyone after it happens. And for me, what I think I tried to do with this film is to take viewers on the same journey I went, because I was like them. You know, when I arrived in New York City, I had seen the video, and that was it. The most of the work was done by the American filmmaker, and I really wanted it to be this way. You know, I wanted to be the regular like person who has only seen the video and is diving into it and is trying to get answer and trying to understand what happens. And I found that after like meeting the lawyers, meeting the family, meeting policemen in New York City, meeting everyone, every night when we were going to bed after like a full day of shoots, we had a different understanding, you know. And I was working with a German director of photography, and it was really interesting because so I'm French, and I didn't want my upbringing to be alone, like navigating all these questions, you know. And so I felt having someone from a different nationality, having a different look would be a lot more interesting. So here we were in the car, you know, debating what we had just learned, and it was really interesting because so many times we didn't feel the same way, you know. But every time we were swayed in one direction in another. And I think in the editing room, after that, we edited for about 2 months. And in the editing room, that's really what I wanted to bring. I wanted to remember what was like I was swayed by in every person's testimony. And I wanted to bring it to the audience so that they could have the same chance at a journey and in the end, make up their own mind, you know. And to me, that was what was really interesting. And I think in this world where everything is so polarized, what I wanted to do with this film was to bring back nuances, you know. And I think nuances are brought by human stories, by human emotions, by like listening to everyone different perspective of like everyone trying to do a good job, you know, and trying to bring things to light. And so yeah, I was just trying to give an opportunity to everyone to see things beyond the video, and in the end have their own point of view without having the filmmaker telling them what to think, you know.
Right, definitely. You know, you obviously are were able to be in the home of Eric Garner's widow. And I'm wondering, you know, what was that experience like, you know, just being in their home, and obviously as a filmmaker and documentary filmmaker, trust is really important with the subjects within the film. And so, you know, what was she like? What was that experience like?
Well, they were very welcoming, and I think that had a lot to do with Roy, the New York filmmaker that was with me, and he introduced us first. He wasn't there for the interview, but he's the one that made the connection. So she was all in for the other project, and she had agreed months before upon having us come to interview her. So that was really important. And then I think there's one thing is that in an interview, you have two different ways of conducting it. You know, you can either be like a news reporter that just goes there and wants sound bites and just like, you know, is like going after something, or you can just take the time and sit with people and listen to what they have to say at this point in their life. And I think that's really what we did. We tried not to be in their way too much because the camera is so intrusive. And I think in her case, what's really hard is that she had to repeat that story so many times, you know. And plus because there was never a court, there was never really a trial for her. It's still this unfinished story that she needs to tell so that we don't forget, and so that one day she can hope for some kind of closure, you know. So we were in this position, like when we interviewed her, like years had passed already. And so So I think what we did was just, yeah, like sitting in and listening. And I think in that interview as well, what I was really trying to capture was the human connection bonds and what it did to the family, besides the fact that it was horrendous what happened. But I wanted to kind of like have a feel of like the family, of like what they went through. And we was in her own words, because I feel like these are things that you don't get in news stories, you know. You get the pain, but you don't really get how. And of course, I mean, she is depicting someone she loved, you know. So, but I think that's super important. You know where she comes from, you know why she's talking about, but you can hear those words.
Yeah, I definitely think that's important. And I think that's, unfortunately, that's part of it that we don't get, right? Like, we've seen the video plenty of times. We understand the pain, but we don't also get to see just um, that humanity, right? And you, as some of the things that she said in terms of like, you know, the last thing that they said to each other was "see you later," and you know, sending a text at 2:30. It's like those are those moments that we don't get to hear. Like you said, it can be very polarizing, but I do think we're able to see kind of all sides in this documentary. One of the things that I'm just gonna geek out, nerd out filmmaker for a second. One of the things that I'm always interested in documentaries, especially, is opening images, right? So the opening of this documentary, we're able to fly through the streets of New York City. We see New York City with this voiceover of the news. Why did you want to start out with those images?
So I actually started out inside the school, because, so what's really interesting is that that film was shot inside a New York high school that is a former prison, and it's been turned into government and justice school, where kids learn very early on about the justice process. And I learned that you have a couple of schools like this in New York City that have their own courtroom, because the kids are really learning about law. And that's why it was taking place in that school, because they had a courtroom that the filmmaker could rent. And so leading up to the trial, we asked the school if we could meet with the students, you know, and ask them what they thought about Eric Garners' death, to have like some kind of perspective on how it affected them, it affected the community. And they say, well, they're actually going to talk about it in class. So if you guys want, you can come. And so to us, it was really interesting to have their perspective starting the film, but also to remind you guys, this film was made for France, was made for Europe, where the Eric Garner story was all over the news for some time, but you're also less familiar with it. And the fact that there was never a trial is a concept that's hard to explain, you know, but you need to explain it like very early on in the film. And so that was our way in, because the teacher had to explain it to the student. And so that was great for us to explain our audience kind of what happened, which I guess for an American audience is less necessary, because you guys have followed the like story every single step. But that's why I needed it. And then after that, for those shots of New York and those like news voiceover, I think, first of all, same thing, French people, we wanted to have them like dive into this environment, remembering those voices, remembering what happened following the case. But also what I wanted to try to do with this film was to go meet all those different participants in the trial that were linked a way or the other with Eric Garner, and that live in very different boroughs. And I think the only filmmaker way I could make it work so that you will have this feel of distance, because that's really what's happening. Like what happened to Eric Garner was on Staten Island. The lawyers, some live in Manhattan, some live in Long Island. You had some people from the Bronx. And so we wanted to go from one interviewee to the other and film the city to show how like all those different worlds kind of like come together in this trial. And I think that's why at first we called it The Color of Justice, because to me that was a question, you know, how much did race play into the fact that there was never a trial? And that's what I wanted to have answers for. And I don't think I really do have answers for, you know, in this specific example, but I wanted to explore it through this film. And so that was also for me a question of location, of communities, and how it all like goes together. So that's what we were trying to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that context, and I definitely think it ties into my next question, which is about the cinematography. It looks absolutely gorgeous. It's well shot. But one thing I did notice is that it seemed like, in terms of color grading, it was a little bit desaturated. Many of the times it was like overcast, and that could have just been a rainy couple of weeks when you were shooting or whatever. But I wanted to know if that was done on purpose, and just the cinematography, because I think that it also helps us to get into the investigatory mood, right? It's not this bright, happy piece, but it's one that's more pensive that we have to really kind of get into.
Yeah, so the weather was awful. I was telling you, we shot for 3 weeks. We had the worst weather in New York City. It was freezing, snowing. And so that's part of it. But I think when it came to color grading, I'm really the one that insisted that I actually liked, because we shot in 4K. And so we had a lot of leeway with the pictures. And so I'm the one that really insisted that the part that we shot, so the interviews and like all those like traveling shots, that we would keep them as close as possible to the original, because I wanted there to be a difference between like the interviews that we made and those kind of things, and the fake trial, which would have like a lot more like bright color once you're inside the courtroom, and then when we're outside, bringing more the shades. And I think all this film to me was about like bringing nuances and shades into the story. And so to me, that was the tone that was reflecting my experience over there.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting about the beauty of New York, which you capture. There's certain nighttime images, and just the buildings and the landscape, but then also the ugliness and maybe muddiness of this subject, right? I'm honestly, I'm just kind of thinking in the moment right now, but I wanted to ask you if you also kind of see that, like setting that up as a filmmaker visually.
I think for us, the key was that we were not going to travel around New York City to find like those shots that you see in every film, because the key for us was to really make pictures in the on the block where we were filming, because we wanted to capture their universe. And so I guess that makes for a different feeling, because like, for example, when you see those travelings of trees, and we're just filming in the sky, those trees, that's from driving all the way to Long Island to meet the prosecutor team. And it was just like all those trees like forever, and it didn't feel like New York City anymore. And we were in the car and we were just reflecting on this old story, and we're like, this is really like, at this point we're just lost, we don't know what to think anymore. And so that's what I kind of like wanted to reflect by like putting at this moment those kind of shots. So I was really trying to take the audience on this journey with me, which was not to try to portray the most beautiful or the worst areas of New York. Or it was just trying to capture the place where we were at, where we were filming. And so we spent some time also on the square where it all happened, and so we spent some time during the day, but we also went back at night, and we just waited and waited. And like, you had different people coming and that were asking what we were doing. Some wanted us here, some really didn't. And we were just trying to understand what we could film, trying to be part of the landscape but every time it would be for an hour, because then they would tell us to leave. So I think those are really like spur of the moments, we are there, we're capturing what we're seeing, and then we move on. And that's, I think, kind of like probably the feel of the film, where like very often for documentary, and that's something that I love, you get to interview people over and over again. And so trust builds in, and then you can get more. Here, we didn't have this opportunity. And so it was all about like capturing the moment. And so I think that is something that you can probably feel while watching the film. You're with them, it's very intense, and then you move on to another part of the story.
One of the things that I find really interesting, in terms of watching this film, is how, regardless of how we may feel, right? You can hear Eric Garner say, "I can't breathe," right? Um, when it comes to American justice and the American justice system, the way that the law upholds might not be human, compassionate as we are as viewers, and therefore looking at the legal system and how in many cases uh, police officers might be doing what is legally correct, right, but it results in death. What have you learned from your experience? And I think it's really cool in the sense that you're not American, right? Is so what have you learned about the American justice system, and what are your thoughts on that?
So I think, yeah, I mean, what was really interesting for me working on this project is that, yes, I'm white, but I'm European. And I think that changes also the relationship with the people that we were meeting, because I was white and I, I was not gonna change up with any like otherwise. But I also, and I had spent like several years in America before doing this film, so I knew enough about the culture to be able to understand things. But at the same time, you're always an outsider, and so they were also explaining things to me, and sometimes I was asking them things from the perspective of an outsider that doesn't know things about the American culture, because I knew that my audience didn't know them, and so that allowed me to ask questions that maybe an American filmmaker wouldn't ask, because they would assume that everyone knows in America. I think there's at some point this thing about we're interviewing one of the prosecutors, and we're talking to him about why the outcome of the trial, you know, and what he thinks and how difficult it is in America to convict a police officer, you know. And I think that's a question that I'm asking as a foreigner, because that's something that might be a given for a lot of people in America, because they have lived this their entire life. But that's not at all a given for us in Europe, because we don't have the same sympathy for like policemen, for the army, you know. It's like, it's always like kind of like the population against policemen, or like there's this thing that it's just so different. And so I needed in the film for the European audience to have someone say that, you know. And so those are things that are there, and I think that come from just coming from a different world. Going back to your question about what I learned, I think what was the most surprising to me that I had no idea about the American justice system, because I think in the end, this film is really a film about the American justice system. And it's the fact that the victim is represented by the state. And the state's prosecutors, they have so many cases, right? And no matter how wealthy the family is, it doesn't matter, because it's the state versus the Pantaleo in this case. And so I was speaking with, and I think that's why like all the lawyers played their role really well, because I was speaking with the lawyers representing the victim, and at the beginning you think that they're going to have a really easy case, and that's how they feel as well, right? And so they prepared it, but they feel like they have everything and that it's going to go really smoothly, and they have so many other cases. Whereas on the other side, Priya Chaudhary, who is representing the police officer, she is a top-notch New York lawyer, and she really takes this case like she would if it was, you know, like this really important client, and if the police union were paying her to do it. And so she's been working for over a year, like so many nights, trying to see how she can get them, you know. And she's really like trying to show like what justice should be and how well the client should be defended, right? And so I feel like she does a stunning job, you know, like no matter what you think about the film and about the outcome, she is really good. And I think that's something that I didn't know about the US system, that actually the person with that is like in this case the police officer, they get to pay, they pay the lawyer, but then they can get great lawyers, whereas the victim is represented by the state, and so they get whatever they get, and they can be really lucky and get someone really amazing, or they can have someone that's overworked and cannot just do the job. And so to me that was really revealing, and I was like, it's kind of like tipped towards wealthy people who are accused of doing something, you know? And so
Yeah.
that was like, I think, my big takeout. And then as we moved towards the end of the filming and the end of the film, and so at the end of the editing as well, I think I really realized also the role that firearms play in all of this and the violence. And I think that might be really as a European audience where when I see those figures, and that's why I decided to end the film with this figure of like how many people have been killed by the police in the last year. It's because for us, those numbers are just staggering, you know? And so I think it brings fears on both sides. That's really the feeling that I had, you know, because I was speaking with those top cops and they were just so afraid, you know. And then on the other side, you were people speaking to people in different communities and they were really afraid as well of the cops. And so I think to me, this all brought up fear, you know, and fear of being killed, and how rough also life is in those communities. So.
Yeah. I think that is one of the things that just even in today's climate, with George Floyd and everything that's been happening this summer in America, it's like you said, the fear that seems to drive sometimes these incidents, when a lot of times people just want to go home. Unfortunately, we're going to kind of have to wrap out here. But Marjolaine, if you could, what do you want audiences to take away after seeing your film?
I wanted to make this film so that people will feel empowered to think the way they feel, you know. And I think that was kind of like a film to be like, there is not just a black and white truth in everything, and watch it and then have discussions about it and create like constructive discussions about it. And I wanted to push audiences to be able to feel like they can hear and see the opposing point. And I think in the end, this film is not going to change the way you thought about it before, you know, but at least hopefully you can hear what other people feel and why they feel differently. And hopefully that can bridge the divide, because I essentially feel like as a society, just like dividing ourselves and isolating us in worlds where we feel like we're right, but then we're not exchanging with people that think differently, doesn't take us in the right direction.
Yeah, most definitely. If you could, how can people follow you on social media? How can people find out more about the film?
Sure, they can follow me on Twitter. And so feel free to reach out if you want to discuss it further. Yeah, I think that's the best way.
Awesome. Well, folks, that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Marjolaine for being a part of this Q&A. Remember, you can go to dcbff.org for more details about the festival and this year's lineup of films and events. If you would like to ask specific questions about the film that you just watched, I want you to visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/DC Black Film Festival, and find this Q&A so that you can ask Marjolaine questions directly. Thanks again for your support and enjoy the rest of the fest.